The sound of a revolver's hammer being cocked echoed through the saloon, silencing even the piano player who'd been pounding away at the keys. Florence Wilson stood her ground, her green eyes never leaving the face of the man who had made her life a living hell for the past 2 years. "You ain't leaving, Flo," Henry Dobbs growled, his liquor-soaked breath reaching her even from 10 paces away. "You're my wife, and you'll do as I say." Florence's hand didn't waver as she kept her own pistol trained on him. "Not anymore, Henry. I'd rather die than spend another night under your roof." It was 1878 in Copper Creek, a dusty mining town nestled in the Colorado Territory. Florence had married Henry Dobbs at 19, believing his promises of love and protection. By 21, she'd learned those promises were as empty as the whiskey bottles that littered their cabin floor. "You walk out that door," Henry shouted loud enough for everyone in the establishment to hear, "and you'll be nothing but a filthy woman. No decent man will have you." Florence's laugh was bitter. "Then I'll be filthy. It's better than being dead." With that, she backed toward the door, keeping her gun raised until she slipped out into the night. The town of Copper Creek wasn't kind to women who left their husbands. Within days, Florence found herself unable to purchase goods at the general store, turned away from the boarding house, and whispered about by women who'd once called themselves her friends. The only person who would sell her supplies was old Mr. Jenkins, and even he did so with reluctance, slipping her parcels through the back door of his store after hours. "You shouldn't have done it, Miss Florence," he'd said the first time. "A woman needs protection in these parts." "Not the kind Henry Dobbs was offering," she'd replied, taking her meager supplies and disappearing into the night. For 2 weeks, Florence camped in a small cave in the foothills outside town, venturing in only when necessary. She'd taken her horse, a sturdy mare named Penny, and what little money she'd managed to save over the years. It wasn't much, but it would get her to Denver if she was careful. On what was to be her last night in the area, Florence rode into town one final time for supplies. She'd tied Penny behind Jenkins' store and was waiting for the shopkeeper when a shadow fell across the alley. Well, if it isn't the filthy woman herself. Florence turned to find 3 men blocking her path, friends of Henry's who'd spent more hours in the saloon than working their claims. "I'm just here for supplies, then I'll be gone," she said calmly, though her heart raced. Her hand inched toward the pocket where she kept her small revolver. "Henry's mighty upset about you stealing his horse and his money," said the tallest of the men, a brute called Barker. "Thought we might bring you back, earn ourselves a reward." Florence pulled her revolver, but Barker lunged forward, knocking it from her hand. She screamed as the men grabbed her, one clamping a filthy hand over her mouth. "No one's going to help you," Barker sneered. "Whole town knows what you are." Then came a voice from the darkness. "I wouldn't be too sure about that." The men turned, Florence still struggling in their grip. At the end of the alley stood a tall figure, silhouetted by the light from the street. He stepped forward, and she could make out a lean man in his late 20s, with dark hair and a weathered face that spoke of years under the sun. He wore simple trail clothes, dusty from riding, with a gun belt slung low on his hips. "This ain't your business, stranger," Barker said, eyeing the newcomer warily. "I'm making it my business," the man replied evenly. 3 against 1 woman doesn't seem sporting. Why don't you let the lady go and we can discuss this like gentlemen?" The man holding Florence tightened his grip. "She ain't no lady. She's a filthy woman who ran out on her husband." The stranger's eyes hardened. "Is that so?" He stepped closer, his hand hovering near his revolver. "Then I reckon I'll be filthy too. Now let her go." The unmistakable sound of a hammer being cocked punctuated his words. The men hesitated, looking from the stranger to Florence and back. "Henry Dobbs won't take kindly to interference," Barker warned. "Henry Dobbs isn't here," the stranger pointed out, "and I'm not asking again." After a tense moment, Barker nodded to his companions. They released Florence, shoving her roughly toward the stranger. "You'll regret this," Barker promised as they backed away. "Both of you." The stranger kept his gun trained on them until they disappeared around the corner, then holstered it smoothly. "Are you hurt, madam?" Florence straightened her clothing, trying to recover her dignity. "No, thanks to you." She bent to retrieve her fallen revolver. I appreciate the help, but you shouldn't have involved yourself. They're right, this town has no love for women like me. Women who stand up for themselves. The stranger's mouth quirked in a half-smile. I've always had a fondness for those. Women who leave their husbands, Florence corrected bitterly. I'm afraid you've just ruined your reputation in Copper Creek before you've even established one, Mr. Calloway, Cole Calloway. He tipped his hat. And I've never been one to care much about reputations, Mrs. Florence Wilson, she said, using her maiden name for the first time in years. Though most folks just call me Filthy now. Cole Calloway studied her for a long moment. I doubt that's true of your character, Mrs. Wilson, and I've never been one to judge a book by what others say about it. Before Florence could respond, the back door of Jenkins' store creaked open. The old shopkeeper peeked out, his weathered face tense with worry. Florence, is that you? I heard voices, he spotted Cole and his expression darkened. Who's this? A friend, Florence said quickly. Mr. Jenkins, this is Mr. Calloway. He just helped me with a situation. Jenkins looked between them suspiciously. Those were Dobbs' men I heard, weren't they? You're playing with fire, girl. I'm leaving tonight, Florence assured him. I just need those supplies you promised. The old man sighed and beckoned them inside. Come on then, both of you. Best not linger in the alley. Inside the storeroom, Jenkins quickly gathered the items Florence had requested: flour, coffee, beans, ammunition for her revolver, and a few other necessities. This is the last time, Florence, he said, his voice low. Henry came by earlier with the sheriff. They're saying you stole more than just the horse, claiming you took a considerable sum of money and some family heirlooms. Florence's face flushed with anger. That's a lie. I took only what was rightfully mine, money I earned taking in laundry and mending. Jenkins raised a placating hand. I believe you, girl, but it doesn't matter what I believe. The law's on his side. Cole, who had been silent during this exchange, cleared his throat. Where are you headed, Mrs. Wilson? Florence hesitated, unsure whether to trust this stranger with such information. Denver, she finally said. I have a cousin there who might take me in until I find work. Cole nodded thoughtfully. It's a long ride to Denver for a woman alone, especially one with angry men on her trail. I don't have much choice, Florence replied, her chin lifting defiantly. Actually, Cole said, you do. I'm headed north myself, past Denver. I could accompany you at least that far. Jenkins made a disapproving sound. Girl, you don't know this man from Adam. I know he helped me when no one else would, Florence countered, then turned to Cole. Why would you do this, Mr. Calloway? You've already put yourself at risk on my account. Cole's expression was unreadable in the dim light of the storeroom. Let's just say I've seen what men like your husband can do, and I don't much care for it. Besides, I'm headed that way regardless. Florence studied him, trying to discern his true motives. There was something in his eyes that spoke of his own painful history, but also a steadiness that she found herself instinctively trusting. Very well, she decided, but I insist on paying my own way. A faint smile crossed Cole's face. I wouldn't have it any other way, Mrs. Wilson. They left town under cover of darkness, riding north along deer trails rather than the main road. Florence kept glancing back, half expecting to see torches and a posse in pursuit, but the night remained quiet except for the steady rhythm of their horses' hooves. Cole rode slightly ahead, his posture relaxed but alert. He hadn't asked further questions about her situation, for which Florence was grateful. The less he knew about Henry Dobbs, the better for both of them. They made camp in a small clearing near a stream, far enough from the trail to avoid detection but close enough to water for the horses. Cole efficiently built a small, nearly smokeless fire while Florence unpacked some of her provisions. You've done this before, she observed as she watched him arrange branches to shield their small flame from view. A time or two, he acknowledged with a slight smile. You learn a few tricks when you've lived on the trail, and have you? Lived on the trail, I mean, Cole nodded, settling back against his saddle. Most of my adult life. Worked cattle drives, did some scouting for the army, tried my hand at prospecting once or twice. No wife waiting somewhere. Florence asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. I'm sorry, that's none of my business. No wife, Cole confirmed, seemingly unbothered. Never found the right woman, or maybe never stayed in one place long enough to notice her if I did. He poked at the fire with a stick. What about you? If you don't mind my asking, how did you end up married to a man like Henry Dobbs? Florence sighed, wrapping her arms around her knees. My father died when I was 18, left my mother and me with debts we couldn't pay. Henry offered to settle them if I'd marry him. He seemed kind enough at first, and my mother. She trailed off, lost in memories. Well, she didn't have many options either. And when did he change? Cole asked quietly. He didn't. I did. Florence stared into the flames. I stopped being afraid, stopped accepting his excuses, stopped believing I deserved what he was doing. That's when the real trouble started. Cole was silent for a long moment. Your mother died last winter, influenza. Florence blinked back tears. She never got to see me stand up for myself. Maybe it's better that way. She always worried so much. I think she'd be proud, Cole said. Takes courage to walk away with nothing but your name. Florence gave a short, bitter laugh. I don't even have that anymore. In the eyes of the law, I'm still Florence Dobbs. Names are just words folks call us, Cole replied. It's our actions that show who we really are. They fell into a companionable silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts as the fire burned low. When it was time to sleep, Cole took first watch, insisting that Florence get some rest. I'll wake you in a few hours, he promised. Florence nodded gratefully, rolling herself in her blanket. Despite the hard ground and uncertain future, she slept more peacefully than she had in years, knowing someone was watching over her who expected nothing in return. The next morning dawned clear and cold. They broke camp quickly, erasing all signs of their presence before continuing northward. Cole seemed to know the terrain well, leading them through valleys and passes that kept them hidden from the main trails. How do you know this country so well? Florence asked as they navigated a particularly steep slope. Cole patted his horse's neck as the animal picked its way carefully down the incline. Spent a summer working for a rancher near here about 5 years back. Used to move cattle through these hills to summer pasture. You've done a lot of different jobs, Florence observed. Never been one to stay put, he admitted. Always figured there was something waiting over the next horizon. And what's waiting for you now? Beyond Denver, I mean. A shadow crossed Cole's face. Got some business to attend to in Wyoming territory. Personal matter. His tone discouraged further questions, and Florence respected his privacy. They all had secrets, after all. By midday, they had covered a good distance, but the weather was turning. Dark clouds gathered on the western horizon, promising a storm. Cole studied the sky with a frown. We need shelter, he said. That's going to be a bad one. Florence followed his gaze. There's no town for miles. No, but there's an old line shack about an hour's ride from here if it's still standing. Used to belong to the ranch I worked for. They pushed their horses harder, racing against the approaching storm. The temperature dropped steadily and the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain. By the time the small cabin came into view, the first heavy drops were beginning to fall. The line shack was weathered but intact, nestled in a small grove of pine trees that offered some protection from the wind. Cole dismounted quickly and led both horses to a lean-to on the cabin's leeward side while Florence gathered their saddlebags. Inside, the cabin was dusty but dry. A simple plank table, 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, and a narrow bed frame with a straw-tick mattress constituted the entirety of its furnishings. Not exactly the Palmer House Hotel, Cole remarked with a wry smile as he shook the rain from his hat. Better than a cave, Florence replied, thinking of her makeshift shelter outside Copper Creek. Cole raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. Instead, he set about lighting the stove while Florence hung their wet coats near the door. The storm intensified as evening approached, rain lashing against the small windows and wind howling through the cracks in the cabin's walls. They shared a simple meal of beans and hardtack, warming themselves by the stove's heat. We might be here a day or two, Cole said, glancing toward the window. These spring storms can be persistent. Florence nodded, trying not to show her concern. Every day delayed was another day for Henry to rally men to his cause. The sheriff of Copper Creek was his drinking companion. They'd already have telegraphed descriptions ahead to Denver. You're worried about your husband, Cole observed, reading her expression. Ex-husband, Florence corrected automatically. And yes, Henry isn't the type to let things go, especially when his pride is hurt. Cole considered this. What will you do in Denver? Your cousin, will they be able to hide you? For a while, perhaps, Florence said, but eventually I'll need to support myself. I'm hoping to find work as a seamstress or laundress. And if Henry follows you there, Florence's hand unconsciously moved to the pocket where she kept her small revolver. Then I'll deal with that when it happens. Cole nodded, understanding in his eyes. Sometimes running isn't the answer. Sometimes you have to stand and fight. Is that what you're doing? In Wyoming? The question slipped out before she could stop it. A muscle tightened in Cole's jaw. Something like that. The cabin fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and the relentless patter of rain. Finally, Cole spoke again, his voice quiet. My brother was killed 3 years ago, shot in the back by a man named Fletcher Blackmore. Florence's breath caught. I'm sorry. Clayton was the steady one, Cole continued, his gaze fixed on the fire. Had a small spread in Wyoming, a wife, 2 little boys. I was passing through, stayed with them for a spell. Clayton had been having trouble with Blackmore, a big rancher who wanted his water rights. His voice hardened. One night, Clay rode out to check on some strays. Blackmore's men ambushed him on his own land, shot him and left him for dead. And the law? Florence asked gently. Cole's laugh was bitter. Blackmore owns the law in those parts. The sheriff ruled it self-defense, said Clay drew first, but I know my brother, he wouldn't have. So you're going after Blackmore? It wasn't a question, but Cole nodded anyway. Been tracking him for 3 years. He left Wyoming after what happened, moving between Colorado, Montana, even down to Texas for a spell. Now I've heard he's back in Wyoming, thinking the trail's gone cold. Revenge won't bring your brother back, Florence said softly. It's not about revenge. Cole looked at her directly. It's about justice, about making sure he can't do to anyone else what he did to Clayton. Florence understood then. They were more alike than she had realized, both running from one thing and toward another, both seeking something that the law wouldn't provide. What about your sister-in-law, your nephews? Pain flickered across Cole's features. Sarah remarried last year. Good man, a shopkeeper in Cheyenne. The boys are growing fast, he smiled sadly. They write me sometimes when they can find me. The revelation of Cole's past created a new understanding between them. As the evening wore on, they shared more of their stories, Florence telling him about growing up in St. Louis before her family moved west seeking opportunity, Cole describing his years on cattle drives and the wild characters he'd encountered. When it came time to sleep, Cole insisted on taking the floor, giving Florence the narrow bed. I've slept on worse, he assured her when she protested. Besides, a gentleman wouldn't have it any other way. Florence smiled as she settled under her blanket. I thought you were determined to be as filthy as me, Mr. Calloway. In the dim light, she saw his eyes crinkle with amusement. Filthy in reputation only, Mrs. Wilson. My mother would haunt me if I forgot my manners. The storm continued through the night and into the next day, keeping them confined to the cabin. They passed the time playing cards with a dog-eared deck Cole carried in his saddlebags and taking inventory of their supplies. The forced proximity should have been uncomfortable, but Florence found herself increasingly at ease in Cole's company. He was different from any man she had known, direct but kind, confident but not domineering. He listened when she spoke, truly listened, and didn't dismiss her opinions as Henry always had. And though she caught him looking at her sometimes with an expression that made her heart quicken, he maintained a respectful distance. On the afternoon of the second day, as they sat by the stove mending tack while the rain continued outside, Cole suddenly asked, "What would you do, Florence, if you didn't have to run? If Henry Dobbs wasn't a factor?" Florence's hands stilled on the bridle she was repairing. No one had asked about her dreams in so long that the question caught her off guard. "I'd find a small town," she said finally. "Somewhere people didn't know me as Henry's wife or as a filthy woman. I'd open a dress shop, maybe. I've always had a knack for sewing and design." "You'd be good at that," Cole said with certainty. "How would you know?" she asked, curious. He gestured to the neat stitches she was placing in the leather. "Anyone who can mend like that could make a fine dress, I'd wager, and you have an eye for detail." Florence felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. "What about you? If you weren't chasing Blackmore," Cole leaned back in his chair, considering. "Never thought much beyond that," he admitted, "but I suppose I'd like a piece of land someday, something small, manageable. Raise horses, maybe. Not a wife, children?" The questions were bold, but the intimacy of their situation seemed to allow for such directness. A slow smile spread across Cole's face. "Wouldn't mind that either with the right woman, someone strong, independent, someone who knows her own mind." Their eyes met across the small space, and for a moment, Florence couldn't breathe. There was something building between them, something unexpected and fragile and frightening in its intensity. Cole broke the silence first. "Storm's letting up," he said, nodding toward the window where the rain had indeed slowed to a gentle patter. "We should be able to move on tomorrow." Florence nodded, both relieved and disappointed at the change of subject. "Yes, we should reach Denver in a few days if the weather holds." That night, as Florence lay in the narrow bed listening to Cole's steady breathing from his place on the floor, she allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, a different life. One where she wasn't running from Henry, where Cole wasn't bound by his promise to avenge his brother. One where they might have met under different circumstances, but such thoughts were dangerous. She had learned the hard way that dreams rarely matched reality, and that trusting too quickly led to heartache. Whatever connection she felt with Cole Calloway, it would end when they reached Denver. She would go her way, he would go his, and this brief interlude would become nothing more than a memory. With that sobering thought, Florence closed her eyes and willed herself to sleep. The morning dawned clear and cold, the storm clouds retreating to the east. They left the line shack early, riding north through mud and swollen streams, the landscape washed clean by the rain. Cole was quieter than usual, his attention seemingly focused on the trail ahead. Florence, too, kept her thoughts to herself, watching the scenery change as they climbed into higher elevations where patches of snow still lingered in shadowed hollows. By midday, they had reached a ridge overlooking a vast valley. Cole reined his horse to a stop, and Florence pulled up beside him. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, gesturing toward the view. Below them stretched miles of meadow, dotted with spring wildflowers and bisected by a meandering river that glinted silver in the sun. In the distance, snow-capped peaks rose against the blue sky. "It is," Florence agreed, drinking in the sight. After years of feeling trapped in Copper Creek, the vast openness before her felt like freedom itself. Cole was watching her rather than the view, a thoughtful expression on his face. "We should reach the settlement at Pine Crossing by nightfall," he said. "It's small, just a trading post and a few cabins, but we can get fresh supplies there." Florence nodded, trying to ignore the flutter of anxiety at the prospect of encountering other people again. "Will they have a telegraph?" "No," Cole assured her. "It's too remote. The nearest telegraph is at Fort Collins, still 2 days' ride from here." Somewhat reassured, Florence followed as Cole led the way down from the ridge into the valley. They rode through fields of waist-high grass and forded shallow streams, the day growing warmer as the sun climbed higher. By late afternoon, they were approaching Pine Crossing. From a distance, it appeared just as Cole had described, a cluster of log buildings nestled against the foothills, smoke rising from stone chimneys. "Stay close," Cole advised as they neared the settlement. "These remote outposts can be rough." Pine Crossing consisted of a trading post, a stable, a crude saloon, and half a dozen cabins scattered among the trees. A few horses were hitched outside the trading post, and the sounds of men's voices drifted from the open door of the saloon. Cole led them to the stable, where an elderly man with a limp took charge of their horses. "Just passing through," Cole told him as he handed over a coin. "They'll need grain and water. We'll collect them in the morning." The stable keeper eyed Florence curiously, but asked no questions as he led the tired animals into the barn. "We'll get a room at the trading post," Cole said quietly to Florence. "The owner, Wilbur Gray, rents out a couple of rooms to travelers. He's a decent sort, won't ask too many questions." The trading post was a substantial log structure with a wide porch running its length. Inside, shelves lined the walls, stocked with everything from flour and coffee to ammunition, tools and bolts of fabric. A pot-bellied stove dominated the center of the room, surrounded by barrels and crates. Behind a rough-hewn counter stood a barrel-chested man with a gray beard that gave him his name. He looked up as they entered, his shrewd eyes taking in every detail of their appearance. "Afternoon," he greeted. "What can I do for you folks? Need supplies," Cole replied easily. "And a room for the night if you have one available." Gray's gaze shifted to Florence, lingering on her dusty traveling clothes and the absence of a wedding ring. "Just the one room?" he asked, his tone neutral. Cole didn't miss a beat. "Two if you have them." "My sister and I are traveling to Denver." Florence kept her expression carefully blank, grateful for Cole's quick thinking. Even in remote outposts like this, a woman traveling alone with a man who wasn't her husband would raise eyebrows and invite unwelcome attention. Gray seemed to accept this explanation. "Got 2 rooms at the back," he said. $5 for both includes breakfast." As Cole counted out the money, Florence wandered toward the fabric display, her fingers automatically reaching out to touch a bolt of blue calico. It had been so long since she'd had new fabric to work with, new clothes that weren't patched and faded. "Anything you need, just add it to our order," Cole said, coming up beside her. "We should resupply while we can." Florence hesitated. "Are you sure? I can pay my share." Cole's eyes softened. "Consider it an advance on your dress shop. Can't have a seamstress without fabric, can we?" The unexpected kindness nearly brought tears to her eyes. Florence quickly turned back to the bolts of fabric, selecting a modest amount of calico and some thread, trying not to think too hard about what Cole's generosity might mean. They added basic supplies to their order: flour, coffee, salt, jerky, ammunition, which Gray promised would be ready in the morning. Then he showed them to their rooms, small but clean spaces at the back of the trading post, each furnished with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a chair. "Privy's out back," Gray informed them. "Supper's at 6 in the main room for $2 extra each." After he left, Cole lingered in the hallway between their rooms. "I think we're safe here for the night," he said in a low voice, "but we should be careful what we say around others." News travels even in places like this. Florence nodded, all too aware of how quickly gossip could spread and how easily a description of a filthy woman fleeing her husband could be passed along. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." Cole's expression was unreadable. "Get some rest." "I'll see you at supper." In the privacy of her small room, Florence allowed herself the luxury of a proper wash with the basin and pitcher provided, then changed into her cleanest remaining clothes. The events of the past few days had left her little time to consider her appearance, but now, faced with the prospect of dining in a public space, she felt acutely aware of how she must look. She did her best with the small mirror above the washstand, pinning her auburn hair into a neat bun and pinching color into her cheeks. The face that looked back at her seemed different, somehow thinner, perhaps, but also more determined than the woman who had fled Copper Creek. Supper in the trading post's main room was a simple affair: stew, biscuits, and coffee served at a long table where several other travelers had gathered. There were 2 fur trappers heading back to their cabin after selling their winter catch, a father and son team of prospectors, and a grizzled old man who introduced himself as the local mail carrier. Cole played his role as Florence's brother convincingly, calling her Flo with the easy familiarity of a sibling and steering the conversation toward safe topics when questions came too close to personal matters. The meal was nearly over when the door swung open, admitting a gust of cool evening air and 3 men who stomped mud from their boots as they entered. Florence glanced up, then quickly lowered her gaze as she recognized one of them, a cattle buyer named Thompson, who had occasionally done business in Copper Creek. Cole noticed her tension immediately. "Problem," he murmured, leaning close as though passing the salt. "The tall one with the mustache," Florence whispered. "He knows Henry." Cole's expression didn't change, but she felt him shift slightly, positioning himself to better shield her from view. "Finish your coffee naturally," he advised. "Then excuse yourself, I'll follow shortly." Florence did as he suggested, taking a last sip of her coffee before rising with a polite "good night" to the table. She felt Thompson's eyes on her as she walked to the hallway, but he showed no sign of recognition. Once in her room, Florence pressed her ear to the door, straining to hear what was happening in the main room. She caught snippets of conversation, something about cattle prices and a new mining operation to the west, but nothing that suggested Thompson had identified her. 10 agonizing minutes later, there was a soft knock at her door. When she opened it, Cole slipped inside, closing it behind him. "I don't think he recognized you," he said in a low voice. "But he and his companions are staying the night. We should leave at first light before they are up." Florence nodded, trying to calm her racing heart. "Did they say where they're headed?" "Denver," Cole replied grimly. "They're driving cattle to market there." The news was unwelcome. If Thompson reached Denver before them and happened to mention to anyone that he'd seen a woman matching Florence's description. "We need a different plan," Florence said, thinking quickly. "If Henry has spread the word about me, Denver may not be safe." Cole ran a hand through his hair, considering. "We could head north instead," he suggested. "Into Wyoming territory. It would mean a longer journey, but no," Florence interrupted. "I can't ask you to delay your own mission any further. You've already done more than enough, Florence." Cole's voice was soft but firm. "I'm not leaving you unprotected, not now." The sincerity in his eyes made her throat tighten. "Why?" she asked. "Why risk so much for someone you barely know?" Cole was quiet for a moment, as though considering his words carefully. "When Clayton died," he finally said, "there were people who could have helped him. People who saw what was happening with Blackmore but looked the other way because it was easier, because getting involved meant taking a side." His jaw tightened. "I swore I'd never be that person." Florence understood then. Cole's protection wasn't just about her, it was about the man he wanted to be, the promise he'd made to himself after his brother's death. "All right," she conceded, "but I won't go to Wyoming with you. It's too dangerous for both of us." Cole thought for a moment. "There's a settlement called Willow Creek, about 3 days' ride northeast of here. It's growing fast because of a silver strike nearby, new people arriving daily. You could disappear there easier than in Denver." The idea had merit. A boomtown would be less interested in a woman's past than in what she could contribute to its future. And with new people arriving constantly, one more stranger wouldn't draw attention. "Is there a dress shop in Willow Creek?" Florence asked, a faint smile playing on her lips. Cole returned her smile, probably not a good one. Yet, they quickly formulated a plan. They would leave Pine Crossing before dawn, avoiding Thompson and his companions. Instead of continuing east toward Denver, they would turn northeast toward Willow Creek. The journey would be harder, taking them through less traveled territory, but it would keep them away from the main routes where word of a filthy woman might have spread. "Try to get some sleep," Cole advised as he prepared to return to his own room. "Tomorrow will be a long day." As he reached for the door, Florence caught his arm. "Cole," he turned, and for a moment they stood close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could see the flecks of gold in his hazel eyes. "Thank you," she said softly, "for being filthy too." Something flickered in his expression, a warmth that made her pulse quicken. For a breathless moment, she thought he might close the distance between them. Instead, he gently squeezed her hand. "Rest well, Florence," he murmured, then slipped out the door. Left alone, Florence leaned against the closed door, her heart racing with emotions she dared not name. She was running for her life, pursued by a vengeful husband, dependent on a man she'd known for barely a week. She had no business feeling anything beyond gratitude toward Cole Calloway. And yet, as she lay in the narrow bed staring at the ceiling, she couldn't deny that her feelings had grown far beyond gratitude. There was something about Cole, his quiet strength, his unwavering sense of justice, the gentleness behind his weathered exterior that called to her in ways she hadn't experienced before. With Henry, she'd been young and naive, seeing only what she wanted to see until it was too late. But she wasn't that girl anymore. The woman she'd become recognized something genuine in Cole, something worth risking her heart for, if only circumstances were different. If only they weren't both running toward dangerous confrontations with their pasts. With these thoughts swirling in her mind, Florence finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, dreaming of blue skies and open meadows and a small dress shop with her name on the door. They left Pine Crossing in the gray light before dawn, slipping away while Thompson and his companions still slept. Gray, the trading post owner, raised an eyebrow at their early departure, but asked no questions as he handed over their supplies. The day was clear but cool as they rode northeast, following game trails through increasingly rugged terrain. Cole set a brisk pace, wanting to put as much distance as possible between them and Pine Crossing before Thompson, and his men began their journey to Denver. By midday, they had climbed into pine forests where patches of snow still lingered in shaded areas. They stopped briefly to rest the horses and eat a cold meal of jerky and hardtack, neither wanting to risk a fire that might be spotted. "How well do you know this Thompson?" Cole asked as they prepared to move on. Florence wrapped the remains of their food and tucked it back into her saddlebag. "Not well. He came through Copper Creek a few times a year to buy cattle for the Denver market. He and Henry drank together at the saloon." Cole nodded thoughtfully. "Would he go out of his way to report seeing you?" "I don't think so," Florence said after considering the question. "But if Henry has offered a reward?" She didn't need to finish the thought. Money could turn even casual acquaintances into pursuers. They rode on through the afternoon, the terrain growing more challenging as they navigated steep slopes and rocky outcroppings. Cole seemed to know where he was going, occasionally consulting a small, worn map he carried in his pocket. "Have you been to Willow Creek before?" Florence asked as they crossed a shallow stream. Cole nodded. "Passed through about 8 months ago." It was just starting to boom, then lots of tents, a few permanent buildings going up. Silver Strike had just been confirmed. "What kind of place is it? For a woman alone, I mean." Cole considered this. "Rough around the edges, like any mining town, but not lawless. They've got a sheriff, a couple of churches. Women are scarce, which works both for and against you. You'll stand out, but you'll also find plenty of work and people eager to welcome you." "Eager men, you mean," Florence said wryly. A small smile tugged at Cole's mouth. "That too. But a woman who can sew would be worth her weight in silver in a place like Willow Creek. Those miners tear through clothes faster than anything, and most can't thread a needle to save their lives." The thought of building a new life in Willow Creek, establishing her own business, being known for her skills rather than her marital status was appealing. Yet Florence couldn't help wondering what would happen after Cole left to continue his pursuit of Blackmore. As though reading her thoughts, Cole added, "I know the sheriff there, Sam Wilson. Good man. I can introduce you before I move on. He'll look out for you." Florence nodded, pushing away the pang of disappointment at the reminder that their paths would soon diverge. That would be helpful. "Thank you." They made camp that night in a sheltered ravine, building a small fire that would be invisible from a distance. As they sat together in the gathering darkness, sharing coffee and the last of Gray's biscuits, Florence found herself studying Cole's profile, memorizing the line of his jaw, the way the firelight played across his features. "Tell me about your brother," she said suddenly. "Not how he died, but how he lived." Cole looked surprised by the request, but after a moment, a genuine smile softened his face. "Clayton was steady. That's the word that always comes to mind. 4 years older than me, and he seemed to have everything figured out while I was still trying to decide which way was up." He poked at the fire, sending sparks dancing into the night air. He loved that little ranch of his like it was paradise on earth. Worked from sunup to sundown, building something for Sarah and the boys. Had a way with horses that was almost magical, could gentle the wildest Mustang just by talking to it. "You admired him," Florence observed. "More than admired," Cole admitted. "I envied him. Not his ranch or his possessions, but his certainty. Clay never doubted his path, never questioned whether he was doing the right thing with his life." "And you did," Cole's smile turned wry. "Still do, been drifting so long. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever find a place that feels like home." The vulnerability in his admission touched Florence deeply. This was a side of Cole she hadn't seen before, the wanderer beneath the confident exterior, the man still searching for his purpose. "What about you?" Cole asked, turning the conversation away from himself. "Did you always want to be a seamstress?" Florence nodded, warming to the subject. "My grandmother taught me to sew when I was just a girl. She made the most beautiful dresses, could look at a fashion plate in a magazine and recreate it perfectly. I used to dream of having my own shop in St. Louis." Why didn't you? Life, Florence said simply. My father's business failed. We moved west. Then he died, and there was never enough money to start something of my own. She stared into the flames. And then there was Henry. Cole was quiet for a moment. It's not too late, you know. For your dream. The gentle encouragement in his voice made her look up, meeting his gaze across the fire. No, she agreed softly. I suppose it's not. As they settled in for the night, Florence taking first watch while Cole slept, she found herself wondering what might have been if they'd met in different circumstances, if she weren't running from Henry, if he weren't bound by his promise to avenge Clayton. In another life, perhaps they could have built something together, a dress shop for her, horses for him, a home, but such thoughts were dangerous, leading only to heartache. Their paths had crossed for a reason, and soon they would diverge again. Better to be grateful for the help he'd provided than to wish for impossibilities. Still, as she watched Cole's sleeping form in the dying firelight, Florence couldn't help but feel that somehow, in the midst of all this chaos, she'd found something rare and precious, someone who saw her, truly saw her, and didn't turn away. The next 2 days followed a similar pattern, long hours of riding through increasingly wild country, nights spent in makeshift camps under the stars. They encountered no other travelers, which was both a relief and a reminder of how remote their route had become. Cole proved to be an excellent guide, navigating by landmarks and the position of the sun, finding hidden springs when their water ran low, identifying edible plants to supplement their dwindling supplies. On the afternoon of the 3rd day since leaving Pine Crossing, they crested a ridge and saw Willow Creek spread out in the valley below. Even from a distance, it was clear the settlement had grown substantially since Cole's last visit. What had been a scattered collection of tents was now a proper town, with several streets of wooden buildings, a church steeple rising above the rooftops, and the constant movement of people and wagons. It's bigger than I expected, Florence said, surveying what would soon be her new home. Silver has a way of making towns grow overnight, Cole replied. But that works in your favor. More people means more anonymity. They descended into the valley as the sun began its westward slide, reaching the outskirts of town just as shadows lengthened across the dirt streets. The sounds of piano music, laughter, and the clang of a blacksmith's hammer greeted them as they rode past the first buildings. Willow Creek had all the hallmarks of a boomtown saloons doing brisk business, a hotel with a fresh coat of paint, stores with windows displaying goods from back east, and everywhere, men in varying states of cleanliness going about their business. There were women too, Florence noted with relief. Not many, and most appeared to be saloon girls or wives of merchants, but their presence meant she wouldn't be quite as conspicuous as she'd feared. Cole led them to a modest boarding house at the quieter end of the main street. A hand-painted sign above the door read, Mrs. Carson's lodging, clean beds, good food, no troublemakers. Sarah stayed here once, Cole explained as they dismounted. Said Mrs. Carson runs a tight ship but treats her boarders like family. The proprietress herself answered their knock, a formidable woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair pulled into a severe bun and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She looked them up and down, taking in their trail-worn appearance and the fact that they arrived together. We don't take unmarried couples, she said flatly. Before Florence could respond, Cole stepped forward. Mrs. Carson, my name is Cole Calloway. I believe you once hosted my sister-in-law, Sarah Calloway, when she was passing through. Mrs. Carson's expression softened slightly. Sarah. Lovely woman, came through with her boys a few years back. She studied Cole more closely. You do have a look of her husband about you, Clayton, wasn't it? Cole nodded. My brother. And this is, Mrs. Carson turned her gaze to Florence. Florence Wilson, Florence supplied, using her maiden name. I'm looking for lodging while I establish myself here in Willow Creek. Mr. Calloway was kind enough to escort me safely from Colorado territory. The older woman's eyes narrowed slightly, and Florence knew she was assessing the truth of this statement. After a moment, Mrs. Carson seemed to reach a decision. I have 2 rooms available, she said. $5 a week each, includes breakfast and dinner. No gentlemen visitors in the ladies' quarters, no exceptions. Laundry facilities in the back for an extra $1. Payment in advance. Florence reached into her pocket for the money, but Cole was faster, counting out $20. For 2 weeks, he said, handing it to Mrs. Carson. For Mrs. Wilson? Florence started to protest, but the look Cole gave her silenced her objections. They could discuss this later in private. Mrs. Carson accepted the money with a nod. Your room is upstairs, first door on the left, she told Florence. Mr. Calloway, yours is at the end of the hall. Dinner's at 6 sharp. Don't be late, I don't serve leftovers. With that, she turned and marched back into the house, leaving them to collect their belongings from the horses. You didn't need to do that, Florence said quietly as they untied their saddlebags. Consider it an investment, Cole replied, in that dress shop. There was something in his tone that made Florence look up sharply, but his expression gave nothing away as he lifted her bags from Penny's back. They stabled their horses at a livery down the street, then returned to the boarding house to settle into their rooms. Florence's was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, a chest of drawers, and a small desk by the window that overlooked the street. After weeks on the trail, it felt like luxury. Mrs. Carson had left a pitcher of hot water, soap, and clean towels, and Florence gratefully washed away the dust of travel. She changed into her cleanest remaining clothes, a faded blue skirt and white shirtwaist that had seen better days, and did her best to make herself presentable for dinner. When she descended to the dining room, she found Cole already seated at a long table with 4 other boarders, 2 middle-aged men who introduced themselves as clerks at the assayer's office, an elderly woman who taught at the newly established school, and a young widow who worked as a seamstress for the hotel. This last introduction caught Florence's attention immediately. A seamstress, she repeated, turning to the young woman whose name was Emily Parker. I was hoping to find such work myself, Emily brightened. Oh, there's more than enough for both of us. I can barely keep up with the mending, let alone the requests for new shirts and dresses. Mrs. Burns at the hotel is always saying she wishes she could clone me. The conversation flowed easily as Mrs. Carson served a hearty meal of roast beef, potatoes, and apple pie. The other boarders were curious about the newcomers, but not intrusive, seeming to accept at face value that Florence was a widow seeking a fresh start and Cole was an old family friend who had escorted her safely to town. After dinner, Cole excused himself, explaining that he needed to look up an old acquaintance. Sheriff Wilson, he told Florence. I'll see if he's available to meet you tomorrow. As he rose to leave, their eyes met briefly, and Florence felt a now familiar flutter in her chest. There was something different in his gaze tonight, something she couldn't quite name, but that made her both hopeful and afraid. Left alone with her fellow boarders, Florence found herself drawn into conversation with Emily, who seemed eager for female companionship. Have you been in Willow Creek long? Florence asked as they moved to the small sitting room adjacent to the dining area. 6 months, Emily replied, settling into a worn armchair. Came with my husband who had silver fever like all the rest. He didn't make it, mining accident. Her voice wavered slightly, but everyone was kind, especially Mrs. Carson. She let me stay on credit until I found work at the hotel. I'm so sorry for your loss, Florence said sincerely. Emily nodded her thanks. It was hard at first, still is some days. But there's opportunity here for women willing to work. Men outnumber us 5 to 1, and most can't sew a button or cook a decent meal to save their lives. She smiled faintly. They're willing to pay well for such services. I've been thinking of opening a dress shop, Florence confessed. Eventually, once I've saved enough, Emily's eyes widened. A proper dress shop with patterns and fabrics from back east. Oh, that would be wonderful. The miners' wives would beat down your door. Most of them arrived with just what they could carry in a wagon, and there's nowhere to buy decent clothes except through the mail order catalogs. The enthusiasm in Emily's voice was encouraging. Perhaps Willow Creek could indeed be a place where Florence might build something of her own, where her past could remain behind her. Later, as Florence prepared for bed in her small room, she found herself wondering where Cole was, whether he'd found Sheriff Wilson, what they might be discussing. Would Cole tell the sheriff the full truth about her situation? Would he mention Henry? And how long would Cole stay in Willow Creek before continuing his journey to Wyoming? These questions circled in her mind as she lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the muted sounds of the town piano music from distant saloons, occasional laughter, the creak of wagon wheels on the dirt street below. For the first time in weeks, she was sleeping in a real bed in a real town without the immediate fear of pursuit. She should have felt relief, but instead she felt a strange melancholy. Because safety, in this case, meant the inevitable departure of the man who had come to mean more to her than she'd ever intended. With that sobering thought, Florence finally drifted into sleep, dreaming of a small dress shop with blue calico in the window and a stable of fine horses just beyond. The next morning, Florence woke to sunlight streaming through her window and the smell of coffee and bacon wafting up from below. For a disorienting moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then the events of the past weeks came flooding back her escape from Henry, meeting Cole, their journey to Willow Creek. She dressed quickly in her one remaining clean outfit and made her way downstairs, where most of the other boarders were already gathered around the breakfast table. Cole's place was empty. "Mr. Calloway asked me to tell you he'd return by midday," Mrs. Carson informed her as she poured Florence a cup of coffee. "Said he had business to attend to this morning." Florence nodded, trying to mask her disappointment. She'd hoped to discuss their next steps with Cole over breakfast, to understand how long he planned to stay in Willow Creek before continuing to Wyoming. After breakfast, Emily offered to introduce Florence to Mrs. Burns at the hotel. "She's been saying for weeks that she needs another pair of hands," Emily explained as they walked down the main street. "Especially someone who can do more than just mending." Willow Creek looked different in the morning light, less intimidating, more like a town finding its footing. There were women sweeping storefronts, children playing in side streets, men going about their business with purpose rather than revelry. The Grand Hotel was the largest building in town, a 3-story structure with a wide veranda and fresh paint. Inside, the lobby was furnished with surprisingly elegant chairs and tables, a nod to Eastern civilization in the midst of frontier chaos. Mrs. Burns, the hotel manager's wife, was a brisk, efficient woman in her 40s who listened with interest as Emily introduced Florence and explained her sewing skills. "Can you start today?" she asked after a brief interview in which she examined Florence's neat stitching on a torn pillowcase Emily had brought along. "I've got 15 shirts that need mending, 2 dresses for the Pearson girls that need hemming, and curtains to be made for the new rooms on the 3rd floor." "Yes, madam," Florence replied, relieved at the immediate offer. "I'd be happy to begin right away." $3 a day, Mrs. Burns said. "More if you can handle special orders like wedding dresses or fancy ball gowns. We get mining company executives and their wives coming through, and they pay well for Eastern-style finery." It was more than Florence had hoped for. With careful saving, she could accumulate enough to open her own shop within months rather than years. Mrs. Burns showed her to a small workroom at the back of the hotel, already equipped with a sewing machine, a cutting table, and shelves of fabric, thread, and notions. "Emily usually works in here mornings," Mrs. Burns explained, "but she's been so overloaded that she takes work back to her room in the afternoons. You two can sort out how to share the space." Left alone with her new colleague, Florence marveled at how quickly her circumstances had changed. Just days ago, she'd been camping in the wilderness, uncertain of her future. Now she had lodging, employment, and the beginnings of a friendship with Emily, all thanks to Cole. The morning passed quickly as Florence and Emily worked side by side, mending shirts and hemming trousers while sharing snippets of their lives. Florence was careful to keep her story vague. She was a widow from Colorado Territory, looking for a fresh start after losing her husband. It wasn't entirely a lie, though the details were significantly altered. Just before noon, there was a knock at the workroom door. Florence looked up to see Cole standing in the doorway, his hat in his hands. He'd clearly made an effort with his appearance. His clothes were clean, his hair neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. "Mrs. Wilson," he greeted formally, nodding to Emily as well. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Not at all, Florence replied, setting aside the shirt she was mending. Emily, this is Mr. Calloway, the friend I mentioned who escorted me to Willow Creek. Emily smiled warmly. A pleasure to meet you, Mr. Calloway. Florence has been a godsend this morning. I might actually sleep tonight instead of sewing until dawn. Cole returned her smile. Glad to hear it. He turned back to Florence. I've arranged for Sheriff Wilson to meet us for lunch at the cafe across the street if you're available. Florence glanced at her pile of work, but Emily waved her off. Go on, she urged. Mrs. Burns won't mind. We're still ahead of where I'd be working alone. With Emily's assurance, Florence gathered her shawl and followed Cole out of the hotel and across the dusty street to a small cafe that advertised home cooking on a sign above its door. Inside, a heavy-set man in a sheriff's badge was already seated at a corner table, nursing a cup of coffee. Sam, Cole greeted him, extending a hand. Appreciate you making time for us. Sheriff Samuel Wilson rose to shake Cole's hand, then tipped his hat to Florence. Madam, Cole here tells me you're new to our community. Yes, Sheriff, Florence confirmed as they took their seats. I arrived just yesterday. A waitress appeared to take their orders: stew and biscuits for the men, a bowl of soup for Florence, then retreated, leaving them to their conversation. Cole shared some of your situation with me, Wilson said, his voice low enough that nearby diners couldn't overhear. About your husband back in Colorado. Florence tensed, glancing at Cole. How much had he revealed? Only the essentials, Cole assured her, reading her concern. That you left an abusive situation and that Henry might come looking for you. Sheriff Wilson nodded. I've seen it before. Men who think a marriage license gives them ownership rights. Way I see it, a man who raises his hand to his wife forfeits any claim to her loyalty. His straightforward statement surprised Florence, who had grown accustomed to the prevailing view that a wife's duty was to endure whatever treatment her husband deemed appropriate. Unfortunately, Wilson continued, the law doesn't always see it that way. If your husband shows up with legal papers, there's only so much I can do officially. I understand, Florence said quietly. The sheriff leaned forward. Officially. Unofficially, I can make sure you get warning if anyone matching his description arrives in town. And I can make it very clear to him that Willow Creek doesn't tolerate men who mistreat women. He glanced at Cole. Especially when they have friends who feel the same way. The food arrived, interrupting their conversation briefly. When the waitress had gone, Wilson continued in a more normal tone, asking Florence about her work at the hotel and her plans for the future. As they ate, Florence found herself warming to the sheriff. He was direct but kind, with a pragmatic approach to justice that seemed suited to a frontier town. By the time they finished their meal, she felt considerably more secure about her position in Willow Creek. One more thing, Wilson said as they prepared to leave. We're having a town social on Saturday night at the church hall. Nothing fancy, just music, dancing, some food. Good way to meet folks. He smiled at Florence. Might help you feel more at home. That's very kind, Sheriff, Florence replied. I'll consider it. Outside the cafe, Wilson shook hands with Cole again. Good to see you, Calloway. How long are you staying in town? The question hung in the air, and Florence found herself holding her breath, waiting for Cole's answer. Not sure yet, Cole said after a slight hesitation. Got some business to finish, but I'm not in any rush. The sheriff nodded, his eyes moving between Cole and Florence with a knowing look. Well, don't be a stranger while you're here. And Mrs. Wilson, my door's always open if you need anything. After Wilson departed, Cole walked Florence back to the hotel. They paused outside, neither quite ready to part ways. Thank you for arranging that, Florence said. Sheriff Wilson seems like a good man. Cole nodded. One of the best, he'll look out for you. There was an awkward silence, both of them aware of the unspoken question. When would Cole leave to continue his pursuit of Blackmore? Will you come to the social on Saturday? Florence asked, surprising herself with the boldness of the invitation. A slow smile spread across Cole's face. I'd be honored to escort you if you'd allow it. The simple acceptance sent a flush of warmth through Florence that had nothing to do with the midday sun. I'd like that, she said softly. For a moment they stood looking at each other, the busy street fading around them. Then Cole cleared his throat. I should let you get back to work. I've taken up enough of your time. Will I see you at dinner? Florence asked. Count on it, Cole replied, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer before he tipped his hat and walked away. Florence returned to the workroom in a daze of conflicting emotions. On one hand, Cole had not specified when he would leave and had accepted her invitation to the social. On the other, his mission to find Blackmore remained, an invisible clock ticking down their time together. Well, Emily asked as Florence resumed her place at the sewing table. How did it go with the sheriff? Very well, Florence replied, picking up the shirt she'd been mending. He seems kind. Emily gave her a knowing look. And Mr. Calloway. He seems more than just an old family friend, if you don't mind my saying. Florence focused intently on her stitching. He's been very helpful. MMHMM, Emily hummed skeptically. That man looks at you like you hung the moon, Florence. And unless I'm mistaken, you're not entirely indifferent to him either. The observation was too accurate to deny entirely. It's complicated, Florence admitted. We met under difficult circumstances, and he has obligations elsewhere that will take him away soon. Emily's expression softened. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pry. It's all right, Florence assured her. It's just not something I can allow myself to think about too much. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the rhythmic sound of their needles punctuated by occasional conversation about less personal matters, the latest fashion trends from back east, which fabrics held up best to frontier conditions, which of Mrs. Burns' hotel guests were the most particular about their clothing. By the end of the day, Florence had completed most of the mending assigned to her and had begun measuring fabric for the new curtains. Mrs. Burns, checking on their progress, seemed impressed. You've got a good eye and quick hands, she commented. Come back tomorrow, same time. We'll discuss those special orders I mentioned. Walking back to the boarding house in the fading light, Florence felt a cautious sense of optimism. She had work that utilized her skills, a safe place to stay, and the beginnings of a new identity in Willow Creek. If only Henry stayed far away, she might truly build a new life here, and if Cole stayed too. But that was a dream she dared not entertain too seriously. His quest for justice for his brother had defined his life for 3 years. She couldn't expect him to abandon it, no matter what might be growing between them. At dinner that evening, Cole seemed in unusually good spirits, engaging easily with the other boarders and even drawing a reluctant smile from stern Mrs. Carson with a humorous story about a mishap on a cattle drive. Later, when the other boarders had retired to their rooms, Cole asked Florence to join him on the small porch at the back of the house. The spring night was cool but not uncomfortable. The sky above them, a canopy of stars more numerous than Florence had ever seen in Copper Creek. I found work today as well, Cole said as they settled into the porch chairs. At the livery stable, the owner, Jackson, needs someone who knows horses. One of his hands broke his leg in a fall last week. Florence tried to mask her surprise. That's wonderful, but what about Blackmore? Cole finished for her. He's not going anywhere. Been looking for him for 3 years. Another few weeks won't matter. Hope flared in Florence's chest, but she tamped it down. Cole, I can't ask you to delay your search on my account. You didn't ask, he pointed out. And it's not just for you, though I won't deny you're part of the reason. He leaned forward, his expression earnest in the dim light from the kitchen window. Truth is, Florence, I'm tired. Been riding so long, carrying this burden of vengeance that I've forgotten what it feels like to just live. The vulnerability in his admission touched her deeply. What changed? Cole was quiet for a long moment, as though considering his answer carefully. Meeting you, he finally said. Seeing how you're fighting to build something new after everything you've lost. It reminded me that there's more to life than settling old scores. But your brother, Clayton, would want me to live, Cole interrupted gently. Really live, not just exist in this half-life I've been leading. He reached out, his hand covering hers on the arm of the chair. I'm not giving up on bringing Blackmore to justice, but I'm thinking maybe there's room for more than just revenge in my future. The touch of his hand, warm and calloused, sent a tremor through Florence that had nothing to do with the cool night air. What are you saying, Cole? He met her gaze directly. I'm saying I'd like to stay in Willow Creek for a while, get to know you better. See if whatever's growing between us is as real as I think it is. Florence's heart raced at his directness. People will talk, she warned, though it was a weak objection even to her own ears. Cole's mouth quirked in that half-smile she'd come to cherish. Let them. They already call you filthy for leaving your husband. They've been calling me worse things for years. His fingers tightened gently around hers. Some things are worth being a little filthy for. Florence couldn't help but smile at his reference to their first meeting. That night in the alley in Copper Creek. Why did you help me? Really? Cole considered the question. At first, it was simple 3 against 1 wasn't fair odds, but then when they called you filthy for standing up for yourself. He shook his head. It reminded me of what happened with Clayton, people looking the other way, judging the victim instead of the man doing wrong. And now? Florence asked softly, "Why are you helping me now?" Cole's eyes held hers in the starlight. "Now it's because I care about what happens to you, Florence Wilson, more than I expected to, more than might be wise, given our circumstances." The honesty of his answer stole her breath. "I care about you too," she admitted. "But Cole, Henry won't give up easily, and Blackmore is still out there. Our pasts aren't just going to disappear because we wish they would." "No," Cole agreed, "they won't, but maybe we can face them together when the time comes, for now." He hesitated, then continued. "For now, I'd just like the chance to see where this might lead, if you're willing." Florence looked at their joined hands, then up at his face, earnest, weathered, handsome in the soft light from the window. She thought of all they'd been through in the short time they'd known each other, of the trust that had grown between them despite the circumstances. "I'm willing," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "But slowly, Cole, we both have healing to do." The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Slowly it is," he agreed. "Starting with that social on Saturday," Florence returned his smile. "Starting with the social." They sat together a while longer, talking of small things, their new jobs, the town, the other boarders, until Mrs. Carson pointedly closed the kitchen curtains. A clear signal that it was time to retire. As they rose to go inside, Cole kept hold of Florence's hand for a moment longer. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what? For reminding me there's more to life than revenge, for being brave enough to start over, for letting me be part of it." With that, he released her hand and opened the door, following her inside and up the stairs to their separate rooms. But as Florence prepared for bed in her small chamber, she felt anything but separate. Something had shifted between them tonight, a mutual acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing since that first encounter in Copper Creek. For the first time in years, Florence allowed herself to dream of a future that held more than just survival, one that included happiness, purpose, and maybe even love. The next few days established a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Florence spent her days at the hotel workroom with Emily, quickly earning Mrs. Burns' approval with her efficient work and creative ideas. Cole divided his time between the livery stable, where his way with horses immediately impressed owner Jackson Miller, and various errands around town that seemed designed to integrate Florence more thoroughly into the community. He introduced her to the minister's wife, who promptly invited her to join the Ladies' Aid Society. He arranged for her to meet the owner of the general store, who offered to order fabric samples from Denver for her to examine. He even found time to help the school teacher, Miss Abernathy, repair a broken window in her classroom, ensuring that Florence received an invitation to assist with the school's upcoming pageant costumes. Each evening, they would have dinner with the other boarders, then spend an hour or two on the back porch, talking about their days, their pasts, carefully edited on both sides, and their tentative hopes for the future. It was during one of these evening conversations that Cole finally told Florence the full story of his brother's death and his subsequent hunt for Blackmore. "After Clayton was killed," he explained, his voice low in the darkness, "I went a little crazy. Rode straight to Blackmore's ranch, called him out. Would have gotten myself shot if Sarah hadn't followed me, brought the sheriff along." "What happened?" Cole's laugh held no humor. Blackmore denied everything, of course, said Clay had been rustling his cattle that his men shot in self-defense. "And the sheriff, Blackmore's cousin by marriage, backed him up." He shook his head. Sarah begged me to let it go for the boys' sake, said they couldn't lose their uncle too, so you left for a while, tried to help Sarah run the ranch, but he trailed off staring into the darkness. Every time I rode that property, all I could see was Clay's blood on the ground, and Blackmore was still out there, free to do the same to someone else. Florence reached for his hand, understanding the torment he must have endured. So you went after him, Cole nodded. He left Wyoming after the incident, too many questions being asked by people higher up than the local sheriff. I tracked him to Colorado, then to Texas, then back north again, always a step behind. He's careful, never stays in one place too long. And now he's back in Wyoming. According to what I heard in Denver before I met you, he's bought land near the Montana border, trying to establish himself as a respectable rancher again. Cole's jaw tightened. But I've collected evidence along the way, witnesses who will testify about other men Blackmore's intimidated or eliminated, records of land deals that don't quite add up, enough to take to the territorial governor, maybe even a federal marshal. Florence understood then why Cole's mission was so important. It wasn't just about revenge for Clayton, it was about justice for others who had suffered at Blackmore's hands and protection for those who might become his future victims. "You'll have to go," she said softly. "Eventually." Cole turned to her, his expression invisible in the darkness but his voice resolute. "Yes, but not yet, and when I do, I'll come back." He squeezed her hand. "If you'll have me." The promise hung between them, fragile but sincere. Florence wanted desperately to believe it could be true that Cole would return, that they might build something together in Willow Creek. But she knew too well how easily promises could be broken, how quickly circumstances could change. "Let's not make promises we might not be able to keep," she said gently. "For now, I'm grateful for your company and your friendship." If Cole was disappointed by her cautious response, he didn't show it. "Fair enough," he agreed, "one day at a time." Saturday arrived clear and warm, a perfect spring day for the town's social. Florence had spent her free hours over the previous days altering one of the dresses she'd brought from Copper Creek, using scraps of fabric from Mrs. Burns' storeroom to refresh its appearance. The result was a modest but becoming gown of deep blue, with white lace at the collar and cuffs that brightened her complexion. Emily helped her arrange her hair, twisting the auburn waves into an elegant knot at the nape of her neck. "Mr. Calloway won't know what hit him," she teased as she secured the style with pins. Florence blushed, but didn't deny the intent behind her preparations. Despite her caution, she couldn't help wanting to look her best for Cole. When she descended the stairs to the boarding house parlor where he waited, the expression on his face was worth every minute spent on her appearance. Cole stood transfixed, his usual composure momentarily abandoned as he stared at her. "You look." He started, then seemed to run out of words. "Beautiful doesn't seem adequate." Florence felt her cheeks warm. "Thank you, you look quite handsome yourself." It was true. Cole had clearly made an effort, wearing a clean white shirt, dark vest, and his best denims. His hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. He looked younger somehow, less burdened by his past. Mrs. Carson, passing through the parlor, raised an eyebrow at their mutual admiration. "You two had best get going if you want to find seats at the social," she said dryly. "Half the town will be there by now." The church hall was already bustling when they arrived, decorated with wildflowers and paper streamers for the occasion. Long tables held an array of dishes brought by townspeople, and a small band was setting up in one corner. Children darted between groups of adults, their excited voices adding to the festive atmosphere. Sheriff Wilson spotted them immediately and made his way through the crowd to greet them. "Mrs. Wilson, Calloway, glad you could make it." He offered his arm to Florence. "Allow me to introduce you to some of our leading citizens." The next hour was a whirlwind of introductions to the minister and his wife, the mayor and Mrs. Pennington, the banker, the doctor, the school teacher, and dozens of others whose names Florence couldn't hope to remember all at once. Cole remained by her side throughout, his steady presence reassuring as she navigated the social complexities of her new community. Most welcomed her warmly, eager for a new face in their growing town. A few of the women were more reserved, eyeing her fine stitching and graceful manners with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Florence had expected this. Any new woman in a frontier town was both a potential friend and a potential rival. What she hadn't expected was how naturally Cole seemed to fit into the gathering. He knew many of the men already from his previous passage through Willow Creek, and they greeted him with genuine warmth. He listened intently to the mayor's plans for a new courthouse, discussed horse breeding with a local rancher, and even coaxed a smile from the stern-faced banker with a well-placed comment about Eastern financial markets. "You're full of surprises, Mr. Calloway," Florence murmured as they filled plates at the food table. "I wouldn't have taken you for a man knowledgeable about banking." Cole's eyes crinkled with amusement. "My father was a banker in St. Louis before he caught gold fever and moved us all west." Some things stick with you, even when you're trying to forget them. This casual mention of his childhood, something he rarely discussed, touched Florence deeply. Each such revelation felt like a gift, a piece of himself that Cole was entrusting to her care. After the meal, the band struck up a lively tune, and couples began to fill the cleared space in the center of the hall. Cole turned to Florence, a question in his eyes. "Would you care to dance, Mrs. Wilson?" Florence hesitated. It had been years since she danced. Henry had never enjoyed such activities, preferring the saloon to social gatherings. But the music was inviting, and Cole's extended hand even more so. "I'd love to," she said, placing her hand in his. Cole led her to the dance floor with a confidence that suggested he was more accustomed to such settings than his trail-worn appearance might indicate. As he guided her through the steps of a waltz, his hand warm at her waist, Florence found herself relaxing into the rhythm, trusting his lead. "Another hidden talent, Mr. Calloway?" she asked as they moved smoothly among the other couples. He smiled down at her. "My mother insisted all her sons learn to dance properly. Said no Calloway would embarrass her at social functions by shuffling around like a bear with sore paws." The image made Florence laugh, and Cole's smile broadened at the sound. For a few magical moments, as they twirled around the floor, the complications of their situation fell away. They were simply a man and a woman enjoying each other's company, moving in harmony to the music. But reality couldn't be held at bay indefinitely. As they paused between dances, Sheriff Wilson approached, his expression serious. "Calloway, Mrs. Wilson," he said in a low voice. "I need a word with you both, outside if you don't mind." The urgency in his tone alarmed Florence. Had Henry somehow found her already? She glanced at Cole, who had instinctively moved closer to her side. They followed Wilson out onto the church steps, away from the noise and gaiety of the social. The sheriff looked around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard before speaking. "Got a telegram from the sheriff in Denver this afternoon," he said without preamble. "Seems a man matching your husband's description has been asking questions about a woman traveling with a tall, dark-haired man. He was showing your photograph, Mrs. Wilson." Florence's stomach clenched with dread. "Henry's in Denver," Wilson nodded grimly. "Was 3 days ago. Sheriff, there is a friend of mine. He didn't give anything away, but he thought I should know." 3 days, Cole calculated. "If he picked up our trail, he could be here by tomorrow or the next day at the latest," the sheriff agreed. "I'll keep an eye out, but I thought you should be prepared, both of you." Florence felt the fragile security of her new life crumbling around her. She'd known this moment might come, but not so soon. Not before she'd had time to establish herself more firmly in Willow Creek. "Thank you, Sheriff," she managed to say. "I appreciate the warning." Wilson touched the brim of his hat. "I'll let you two discuss your options. Just know that whatever you decide, you've got friends in this town now, Mrs. Wilson, me included." After he walked back inside, Florence and Cole stood in silence, the sounds of music and laughter from the hall a jarring counterpoint to their somber mood. "We should leave," Florence finally said. "Tonight, if Henry comes here, he'll make trouble for everyone who's helped me." Cole studied her face in the dim light from the church windows. "Is that what you want, to run again?" The question gave her pause. Did she want to run? To abandon the tentative roots she'd begun to put down in Willow Creek? The job she enjoyed, the friends she was making, the possibility of her own shop someday? "No," she admitted, "but I don't see another choice." Cole was quiet for a moment, considering. "There's always another choice, Florence. We could stay, face him together. And then what? He has the law on his side. I'm still legally his wife. Laws can be changed or circumvented. Cole took her hands in his. Florence, listen to me. You've been running from Henry for weeks. If you run now, you'll always be running. He'll always have that power over you. The truth of his words sank into her heart. She had fled Copper Creek to escape Henry's cruelty, but in doing so, she had given him a different kind of control over her life, the power to make her afraid, to drive her from any place she might find happiness. What do you suggest? She asked. Cole's expression was resolute in the lamplight. We prepare. We gather allies. And when Henry comes, we show him that he's not welcome in Willow Creek and that you're not alone anymore. The fierceness in his voice, the unwavering support it conveyed, gave Florence courage she hadn't known she possessed. Perhaps Cole was right. Perhaps it was time to stop running and make a stand. All right, she decided. We'll stay, but Cole, I won't have you risking yourself for me. Henry can be dangerous when he's angry. Cole's smile held no humor. So can I when someone threatens people I care about. The intensity in his eyes sent a shiver down Florence's spine, not of fear, but of something far more complex and exhilarating. In that moment, she knew beyond doubt that her feelings for Cole Calloway had grown far deeper than simple gratitude or friendship. We should go back inside, she said softly. People will wonder where we've gone. Cole nodded, but before they could turn toward the door, he drew her closer. Florence, he said, his voice low and serious. Whatever happens in the next few days, I want you to know something. Yes, meeting you. It changed things for me, changed me. I've been drifting for so long, focused only on the past. You made me see there could be a future worth fighting for. The simple sincerity of his words brought tears to Florence's eyes. You changed things for me too, she whispered. You showed me I wasn't alone, that I could be more than just Henry's runaway wife. Cole's gaze dropped to her lips, and for a breathless moment, Florence thought he might kiss her. Instead, he brought her hand to his mouth, pressing his lips to her knuckles in a gesture that was somehow more intimate than a kiss might have been. Come on, he said gently. Let's not let Henry Dobbs ruin our evening before he even arrives. They returned to the social, where the dancing continued in full swing. If anyone noticed their brief absence or the new intensity between them, they were too polite to comment. Florence and Cole rejoined the festivities, dancing and conversing with the townspeople as though nothing had changed. But everything had changed. As they moved through the crowd, Florence was acutely aware of Cole's presence beside her, the brush of his hand against hers, the warmth of his smile when their eyes met, the protective way he positioned himself when they spoke with strangers. And beneath the surface gaiety, they were both preparing for the confrontation that lay ahead, a reckoning that would determine not only Florence's future in Willow Creek, but also the possibility of a shared future with the man who had risked everything to help her begin anew. When Henry Dobbs rode into Willow Creek 2 days later, the town was ready for him. Word had spread quickly, not the full story, but enough. A man was coming to cause trouble for the new seamstress, the one with the quick smile and clever hands who had already endeared herself to half the town. And Cole Calloway, who had proven himself equally valuable at Jackson's livery with his way with difficult horses, was standing by her side. It was mid-morning when the stranger appeared, dust-covered and grim-faced, leading a second horse with a pack saddle. He rode directly to the sheriff's office, where Wilson was waiting, having been alerted by a young boy stationed at the edge of town. Florence, working at the hotel, received word of Henry's arrival from Emily, who had been sent by Mrs. Burns the moment the news reached the hotel. He's at the sheriff's office, Emily reported breathlessly. Mrs. Burns says you're to stay here until Mr. Calloway comes for you. Cole arrived shortly thereafter, his expression tense but determined. Wilson's talking to him now, he told Florence, trying to gauge his intentions. Are you all right? Florence nodded, though her hands trembled slightly as she set aside the dress she'd been working on. Yes, I've been expecting this. She met Cole's gaze directly. I'm not afraid of him anymore, Cole. It was true, she realized. The terror that had driven her from Copper Creek had transformed into something else, a steady resolve to stand her ground, to claim the new life she was building. Good, Cole said, his eyes warm with pride. Because Wilson wants us both at his office in an hour. Says Henry's demanding to see you, and it might be better to do this on our terms with witnesses present. Florence agreed. I'll need to change, she said, gesturing to her work apron. Will you wait? Cole's answer was immediate. I'm not leaving your side until this is resolved, Florence. One way or another. An hour later, they walked together down Willow Creek's main street toward the sheriff's office. Florence had changed into her best dress, not the blue one from the social, but a more practical dark green that nevertheless complemented her auburn hair and fair skin. She walked with her head high, conscious of the curious glances from townspeople who had heard of the stranger's arrival and suspected its connection to the new seamstress. Sheriff Wilson was waiting on the porch of his office, his deputy beside him. Mrs. Wilson, Calloway, he greeted them. He's inside. I've explained that you've established yourself here, that you're respected in the community. He's not happy. I wouldn't expect him to be, Florence replied. Is he armed? Not anymore, Wilson assured her. My deputy made sure of that. Florence took a deep breath, steadying herself. Then let's get this over with. Inside, Henry Dobbs sat at a small table, a cup of coffee cooling before him. He looked older than Florence remembered, his face weathered from travel and his eyes bloodshot from drink or lack of sleep. He rose as she entered, his expression a mixture of anger and something that might have been relief. Florence, he said, his voice gruff, you've led me on quite a chase. Hello, Henry, she replied calmly. I didn't ask you to follow me. His gaze shifted to Cole, who stood protectively at Florence's side. This him. The man who turned my wife against me, Cole's voice was level. Your wife made her own decision, Dobbs. I just helped her reach safety. Henry's face darkened. She's still my wife. Under the law, she belongs with me. I belong to myself, Florence corrected firmly. And I'm not going back to Copper Creek with you, Henry. Not now, not ever. Sheriff Wilson, who had followed them inside, moved to stand behind his desk, a silent but significant presence. Mr. Dobbs, as I explained earlier, Mrs. Wilson has become a valued member of our community. Whatever your legal claims might be, forcing her to leave against her would not be viewed favorably by the citizens of Willow Creek. Henry snorted. Citizens, this collection of miners and drifters. He turned back to Florence. You think these people care about you? They're just using you, same as this man here. He jerked his head toward Cole. No, Henry, Florence said quietly. That's what you did. You used me, my labor, my body, my fear. These people have shown me nothing but kindness and respect. You took my horse, Henry countered. My money, things that belonged to me. I took what I earned, Florence replied. The horse was payment for 3 months of laundry I took in from the mining camp. The money was what I saved from mending and sewing for the women in town. I left everything else. Henry's fist came down hard on the table, making the coffee cup jump. You humiliated me. Everyone in Copper Creek knows my wife ran off with another man. I'm the laughingstock of the town. That's your concern, not mine, Florence said, surprising herself with her steadiness. I left to save my life, Henry. After the last beating, I knew the next one might kill me. Henry's face flushed red. I never 3 broken ribs, Florence interrupted. A dislocated shoulder. Bruises from my neck to my ankles. Dr. Morgan treated me twice, Henry. He knows what you did, even if he was too afraid of you to report it. The blunt recitation seemed to take some of the wind from Henry's sails. He glanced at Wilson, whose expression had hardened at Florence's words. She's exaggerating, Henry muttered. Women do that. No, she's not, Cole said quietly. I saw the bruises that were still healing when I met her. I saw how terrified she was of being found. Henry's gaze snapped back to Cole, hatred plain in his eyes. And what's your interest in my wife, mister? Getting what you want from her in exchange for your protection? Cole moved so quickly that even Wilson seemed taken by surprise. In an instant, he had Henry by the collar, lifting him half out of his chair. Don't you dare suggest such a thing, Cole said, his voice dangerously soft. Mrs. Wilson is a lady deserving of respect, something you clearly know nothing about. Calloway, Wilson warned. Let him go. Cole released Henry, who fell back into his chair, straightening his collar with shaking hands. You'll regret that, he promised. When I take my wife back to Copper Creek, you won't be taking her anywhere, Wilson interrupted. Not from my town, not against her will. Henry stared at him in disbelief. She's my wife. She's also a human being with the right to live without fear, Wilson replied evenly. Now, here's what's going to happen, Mr. Dobbs. You're going to listen to what Mrs. Wilson has to say. Then you're going to make a decision, one that I strongly suggest takes into account the welfare of the woman you claim to care about. With that, Wilson nodded to Florence. Mrs. Wilson. Florence took a deep breath, gathering the courage she had been accumulating ever since she first pointed her gun at Henry in the Copper Creek saloon. I want a divorce, Henry, she said simply. I'll sign whatever papers are necessary. I make no claim on your property or possessions. I just want my freedom. Henry laughed bitterly. A divorce, on what grounds? That I expected my wife to behave like a wife, that I disciplined you when you defied me. No judge will grant that. Cruelty, Wilson suggested. Abandoned by her husband for extensive periods. There are grounds if you look for them, Mr. Dobbs. Henry's eyes narrowed. And if I refuse, Cole stepped forward again. Then we take this to a higher authority, the territorial governor, perhaps, with testimonials from Dr. Morgan and others in Copper Creek who knew what was happening. With evidence of your pursuit across state lines with intent to harm. I never said I'd harm her. You didn't have to, Cole replied. Your reputation speaks for itself. And a public hearing about a man who beats his wife might not go the way you expect, even with the law technically on your side. Florence could see the calculations running behind Henry's eyes. He was thinking about his standing in Copper Creek, about the business connections that depended on his reputation, about the public humiliation of a contested divorce. What do you want? He finally asked Florence. Just my freedom, she repeated. A divorce, clean and simple. You go your way, I go mine. Henry's gaze moved between Florence and Cole, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. So that's how it is, he said softly. You've already replaced me. Florence felt a flush rise to her cheeks, but she met his gaze steadily. My relationship with Mr. Calloway is not your concern, Henry. But for what it's worth, he's shown me more respect in a few weeks than you did in 2 years of marriage. For a long moment, Henry stared at her, as though seeing her clearly for the first time not as his possession, but as a woman who had found her own strength. Finally, he slumped back in his chair. Fine, he said wearily. A divorce. But I want it done properly, with papers drawn up by a real lawyer. No one can say Henry Dobbs didn't do right by his wife, even when she ran off on him. Sheriff Wilson nodded, seemingly satisfied with this resolution. We have a circuit judge coming through in 2 weeks. He can make it official. In the meantime, Mrs. Wilson will remain here in Willow Creek, under the town's protection. He fixed Henry with a stern look. And you, Mr. Dobbs, will either take a room at the hotel and behave yourself, or you'll camp outside town until the judge arrives. Your choice. Henry glanced around the office, taking in the resolute expressions of Wilson, his deputy, Cole, and Florence herself. Whatever fight had driven him to follow his wife across the territory seemed to drain away, leaving only a bitter resignation. The hotel, he muttered. But I want those divorce papers ready when the judge gets here. I'm not lingering in this God-forsaken place any longer than I have to. Wilson nodded. Fair enough. My deputy will escort you to the hotel and help you get settled. He glanced at Florence and Cole. Mrs. Wilson, Calloway, I believe we're done here for now. Outside the sheriff's office, Florence found herself trembling, the tension of the confrontation finally catching up with her. Cole noticed immediately and guided her to a bench on the boardwalk. Sit, he said gently. Take a moment. Florence obeyed, drawing deep breaths of the clear mountain air. I can't believe it, she whispered. After everything, he just gave in. Cole sat beside her, his arm brushing hers in a gesture of quiet support. Men like Henry are cowards at heart. They prey on those they perceive as weaker, but when confronted with real opposition, they fold. Do you think he'll honor the agreement about the divorce? Cole nodded, with Wilson watching him. Yes, he knows when he's beaten. Florence turned to look at Cole, really look at him in the bright morning sunlight. His face was serious, but his eyes held a warmth that steadied her racing heart. Thank you, she said simply, for standing with me. Cole's smile was slow and sweet. Always, Florence. For as long as you'll have me. The promise hung between them, weighted with new possibility now that Henry had agreed to the divorce. For the first time since leaving Copper Creek, Florence allowed herself to truly believe in a future without fear, a future that might include the quiet, steadfast man beside her. "What happens now?" she asked. Cole considered the question. "Now we wait for the judge. You continue working at the hotel, I continue at the livery. We go on building our lives here." He hesitated, then added softly, "Together, if that's what you want." Florence felt a surge of emotion so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. "It is," she whispered. "It's what I want more than anything." Cole reached for her hand, entwining his fingers with hers in full view of anyone passing by on Willow Creek's main street. "Then that's what we'll do," he said simply. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange limbo. Henry kept to himself at the hotel, taking his meals in his room and venturing out only to visit the saloon in the evenings. Florence continued her work at the hotel, her growing friendship with Emily and Mrs. Burns providing a welcome distraction from the knowledge that her husband's soon-to-be ex-husband was just down the street. Cole remained vigilant, but not hovering, walking Florence to and from the boarding house each day, but giving her space to process the imminent dissolution of her marriage. In the evenings, they still sat together on the back porch, but their conversations now turned more explicitly toward the future, a future they both cautiously acknowledged might be shared. "I've been thinking," Cole said one night, about a week after Henry's arrival. "After the divorce is final, after you're truly free, I'd like to court you properly, Florence, if you'd allow it." The formal request, so at odds with the unconventional beginning of their relationship, made Florence smile. "Court me, with calling cards and chaperoned walks." Cole's answering smile was sheepish. "Well, maybe not quite so formally, but with the town's knowledge and approval, with the intention of—" He hesitated, seemingly searching for the right words. "Of," Florence prompted, her heart beating faster. "Of building something lasting," Cole finished. "Something neither of us has had before." The simple sincerity of his statement brought tears to Florence's eyes. "I'd like that very much, Cole Calloway." His smile in response was so brilliant that it took her breath away. They sat in companionable silence for a while after that, hand in hand, watching the stars emerge above Willow Creek. "What about Blackmore?" Florence finally asked, giving voice to the question that had lingered between them since Cole's decision to stay in Willow Creek. "You still need to bring him to justice." Cole nodded, his expression turning serious. "I do, but I've been thinking about that too. I've collected enough evidence over the years to make a case against him. Instead of confronting him directly, I could take what I have to the territorial governor or even to a federal marshal. Let the law handle him." Florence studied his face in the dim light from the kitchen window. "Could you do that? Let someone else bring him in, after everything he did to Clayton?" Cole was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. "A year ago, I'd have said no," he finally admitted. "But now, I've seen what vengeance can do to a man, how it can consume everything else in his life." His hand tightened around hers. "I've found something I want more than revenge, Florence, something worth building a future around." The implication of his words that something filled Florence with a joy so intense it was almost painful. "When will you go?" she asked. "To present your evidence." "After the divorce is final," Cole replied. "After I know you're safe, and then I'll come back, to you." It was the first time either of them had spoken so explicitly of a commitment beyond their current circumstances. Florence turned toward him, searching his face for any sign of hesitation or doubt. She found none, only the steady certainty that had drawn her to him from the beginning. "I'll be waiting," she promised softly. The circuit judge, a stern-faced man named Harrington, arrived in Willow Creek exactly 2 weeks after Henry's appearance. The divorce proceedings were scheduled for his first day of court, a fact that raised eyebrows among the townspeople but was accepted without much comment. Frontier communities understood that sometimes convention had to give way to practicality. Florence dressed carefully that morning in her blue dress from the social, wanting to present a dignified appearance before the judge. Cole wore his Sunday best, a dark jacket over his white shirt, his boots polished to a shine. They walked together to the makeshift courthouse, which had been set up in the town hall for the judge's visit. Henry was already there, seated at a table with Sheriff Wilson nearby. He looked up as Florence entered, his expression unreadable. The proceedings themselves were surprisingly brief. Judge Harrington, accustomed to the pragmatic nature of frontier justice, reviewed the divorce petition that Wilson had helped prepare. He questioned Florence about her claims of cruelty, which she answered truthfully but without elaboration. He asked Henry if he contested the divorce, to which Henry shook his head. "Very well," the judge said after less than an hour of testimony. "Given the evidence presented and the agreement of both parties, I hereby dissolve the marriage between Henry Dobbs and Florence Dobbs, née Wilson. Mrs. Wilson will resume her maiden name and retains ownership of her personal possessions, including the horse currently in her possession. Mr. Dobbs retains all other property from the marriage. This court is adjourned." With the bang of his gavel, it was done. Florence Wilson was a free woman. Outside the courthouse, Henry approached her one last time, Cole watching warily from a few steps away. "So that's it," Henry said, his voice lacking its usual bluster. 2 years ended in an hour. Florence met his gaze steadily. "The marriage ended long before today, Henry, you know that." He nodded slowly, something like regret flashing across his face. "I didn't mean for it to be this way, Flo." "When we married, I know," Florence interrupted gently. "Neither did I, but we can't go back." Henry glanced at Cole, then back to Florence. "You love him." The question was unexpected, but Florence didn't hesitate. "Yes, I do." Henry absorbed this with a slight flinch. "Well, I hope he treats you better than I did." He extended his hand formally. "Goodbye, Florence Wilson." After a moment's hesitation, Florence accepted the handshake. "Goodbye, Henry." With that, Henry Dobbs turned and walked away, mounting his horse at the hitching post and riding out of Willow Creek without a backward glance. Florence watched him go, feeling not triumph or bitterness but a quiet relief. One chapter of her life was definitively closed, another was just beginning. Cole moved to stand beside her, his hand finding hers. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. Florence nodded, turning to face him in the bright sunlight of the town square. "Yes, I'm free." Something shifted in Cole's expression, a tension releasing, a decision made. Without warning, he pulled her into his arms and kissed her, right there on the courthouse steps in full view of half the town. Florence was too surprised to resist, and then too swept away to want to. Cole's lips were warm and certain against hers, his arms strong around her waist. She found herself responding instinctively, her hands sliding up to his shoulders as she returned the kiss with equal fervor. When they finally broke apart, Florence was aware of scattered applause and a few cheers from onlookers. She felt her cheeks flame with embarrassment but couldn't suppress the smile that spread across her face. "Well," she said breathlessly, "that was quite a statement, Mr. Calloway." Cole's answering smile was unrepentant. "I've wanted to do that since the day I met you," he admitted. "Seemed like the right moment to make my intentions clear." Sheriff Wilson, emerging from the courthouse behind them, cleared his throat loudly. "I see you two have things to discuss," he said dryly. "Might I suggest somewhere less public?" Florence laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Yes, Sheriff, I believe you're right." They walked back to the boarding house, hand in hand, accepting congratulations and knowing looks from townspeople along the way. News traveled fast in small communities, and by the time they reached Mrs. Carson's, most of Willow Creek knew that Florence Wilson was not only divorced, but apparently being courted by Cole Calloway. Mrs. Carson herself was waiting on the porch, her stern face softened by what might almost have been a smile. "About time," she said as they approached. "Now, Mr. Calloway, if you're planning to court my boarder properly, I expect you to respect the rules of this establishment." Cole bowed formally. "Yes, madam, no gentleman in the ladies' quarters." The older woman sniffed. "See that you remember it." But as she turned to go inside, Florence caught a definite twinkle in her eye. Left alone on the porch, Florence turned to Cole, still hardly able to believe the events of the morning. "Did that really happen?" she asked. "Am I truly free?" Cole's smile was tender as he reached out to brush a strand of hair from her face. "Free as a bird, Florence Wilson, free to go wherever you want, do whatever you choose." "What I choose," she said softly, "is to stay right here, with you." Cole's eyes darkened with emotion. I still have to go to Wyoming, he reminded her, to present my evidence against Blackmore. I know. Florence touched his cheek gently, and you should. Clayton deserves justice, but then you'll come back. Then I'll come back, he agreed, and we'll build that life we've been talking about. Your dress shop, my horses, a home. The word home resonated deep within Florence's heart. After years of feeling trapped, then weeks of running, the idea of a true home, a place of safety and love, was almost too precious to contemplate. A home, she repeated softly. Yes. That's what I want more than anything. Cole kissed her again, more gently this time. Then that's what you'll have, Florence Wilson, I promise. 3 months later, Florence stood in front of the newly painted sign that hung above the storefront on Willow Creek's Main Street. Wilson's Fine Sewing and Dressmaking. The small shop had been a collaborative effort. Florence had provided the expertise and design, using the savings from her work at the hotel. Cole had contributed the carpentry, building the counter and shelves with his own hands during the evenings after his work at the livery. The townspeople had played their part too, Mrs. Burns donating excess fabric from the hotel, the banker extending a small business loan. Sheriff Wilson ensuring that the building's previous tenant left it in good condition. Inside, spools of thread arranged by color lined one wall, bolts of fabric stood in neat rows, and a selection of dress patterns from back east filled a glass-fronted cabinet. At the rear, a fitting area with mirrors offered privacy for customers, while Florence's prized sewing machine occupied a place of honor near the large front window, where the light was best. It wasn't grand by Eastern standards, but in Willow Creek, it represented something significant: a woman starting anew, building a life of her own choosing. Cole had left for Wyoming 2 weeks after the divorce, carrying his evidence against Blackmore to the territorial governor. He'd been gone for 2 months of anxious waiting for Florence, who knew the dangers he faced even if he wasn't confronting Blackmore directly. His letters came regularly, describing his journey north, his meeting with the governor, who had taken his evidence seriously and promised action, his visit to Sarah and the boys, who were thriving with their new stepfather. The last letter had arrived 3 days ago, stating simply that he was on his way back to Willow Creek to her. Now, as Florence adjusted the display of ribbons in the front window, she caught sight of a rider coming down the main street, a tall man on a familiar dappled gray horse. Her heart leapt into her throat as she hurried to the door. Cole dismounted before the shop, removing his hat as he approached. He looked trail-worn but healthy, his smile widening as he took in the sight of her standing in the doorway of her own business. "Florence Wilson," he said, his voice warm with pride and something deeper. "Shop owner." Florence couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. She simply moved into his open arms, burying her face against his chest as he held her close, heedless of the curious glances from passers-by. "I missed you," she finally managed to say. "Every day," Cole's arms tightened around her, "and I missed you, but I'm back now, for good." Florence pulled back slightly to look up at his face, searching for any sign of lingering burden or regret. "Blackmore." "In custody," Cole replied, satisfaction evident in his tone. "The governor sent federal marshals with my evidence. They arrested him 3 weeks ago. He'll stand trial for Clayton's murder and a host of other charges." Relief washed over Florence. "Then it's over. Your quest." Cole nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "It's over. Clayton has his justice, and He paused, reaching into his pocket. "I have a future to look forward to if you'll share it with me." From his pocket, he produced a small velvet box. Florence's breath caught as he opened it, revealing a simple gold band set with a single small diamond. "Florence Wilson," Cole said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "I've loved you since the moment you stood your ground in that alley in Copper Creek, refusing to be defined by what others called you. Will you marry me?" Tears blurred Florence's vision as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Cole Calloway, I will marry you." Cole slipped the ring onto her finger, then sealed the promise with a kiss that spoke of homecoming, of new beginnings, of a love built on mutual respect and shared courage. When they finally broke apart, Cole looked up at the sign above the shop door. "Wilson's Fine Sewing and Dressmaking," he read. It has a nice ring to it, Florence smiled, touching the new ring on her finger. It does, though someday perhaps it might become Calloway's. Cole's answering smile was tender. I'd be honored. But I fell in love with Florence Wilson, the woman brave enough to walk away from everything she knew to build a new life on her own terms. That name suits you. Perhaps we could compromise, Florence suggested. Wilson Calloway's. Cole laughed, the sound ringing out in the clear mountain air. Whatever makes you happy, my love. After all, they already call us both filthy. Might as well share the reputation along with everything else. Florence joined his laughter, remembering their first meeting. The words that had brought them together, they called her filthy for leaving her man. The cowboy said then, I'll be filthy too. Words spoken in defiance that had somehow led to this moment of perfect happiness. Filthy and proud, she agreed, taking his hand and leading him into her shop, the first room of what would become their shared home, the foundation of a life built not on society's expectations, but on their own definition of honor, courage, and love. As the door closed behind them, Florence knew with certainty that whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them together, two people who had found in each other not just love, but the courage to define themselves on their own terms, regardless of what the world might call them.